Hello everyone! Welcome to my music tutorials for people who want to compose music, but also people who simply want to enjoy music and understand it better. For a while now in my videos I've been showing you how to compose romantic symphonies. Most recently I began showing you the process of composing an early romantic movement. The idea was to take inspiration from Schubert, as if we were continuing his famous unfinished symphony, but the real point is to show you how an early romantic scherzo is put together. As always, let's start with the continuity sketch, the essential thread of music, which I already composed for you in the last video. Let's play the very beginning of it to show you what a sketch sounds like. Very charming, but now it needs to be orchestrated. Let's work on the first 8 measures. I always start with the strings, which are the scaffold of the orchestra. These thirds I'll distribute to the first and second violins, and these larger chords I'll unpack in the full string orchestra. The chords are ordinary 4-part harmony. The basses and cellos double each other an octave apart, creating one larger instrument with a resonant, rich sound. The first violins take the top, and the inner voices, the second violins and the violas, fill in the harmony. The distribution is very simple, nothing fancy, nothing complicated. Everything should be as simple as necessary, but no simpler. Isn't that a good life lesson? Let's listen to it. It's a miniature crescendo. In an orchestral crescendo, you can instruct the instruments to play louder. Here's a crescendo mark. But the real trick to that feeling of crescendo is to add instruments. That's why I started with just the first violins and ended with the full string orchestra. Let's make the other sections of the orchestra follow the same principle. After the strings, I often work on the woodwinds. Let's start with a single bassoon. High bassoons are one of the most beautiful sustaining instruments. The note pops in and hangs for a while, adding a delicate color and resonance to the background. Almost any woodwind instrument can serve that function. A popular choice is the oboe, but I want something more delicate, less penetrating, so I'll use a bassoon. To allow more complexity as the music progresses, I'll add a clarinet and a second bassoon. The harmonies are beginning to fill out. For the next 2 measures, let's increase the complexity again. The clarinets can double the strings, beginning to beef up the melody. The bassoons carry a little counter melody. You probably won't even hear this, but it adds an extra layer. At an unconscious level, it'll affect the listener. It's a signal that the music is expanding toward something. And then, pow, we hit the forte, the peak of this little crescendo, and it's time to add a wall of instruments. Here, I'm voicing a standard woodwind chord. If you're new to orchestration, this chord looks daunting, but really the distribution is so standard that with a little practice, you could do it in your sleep. First, I copied the string orchestra chord into the woodwinds. Second, the flutes are an octave above the strings, and that's usually the right relationship between the upper woodwinds and upper strings. Third, the woodwinds come in pairs, 2 of each, in this early romantic orchestra. Later, composers experimented with 3 of each, and even 6 of each. Here we have 2 of each, and I've used a strict interlocking arrangement. The flutes play an A and an F. The oboes interlock or overlap with the flutes on the F, and they also play a D. The clarinets interlock with the oboes on the D, and they also play an A. Together they form a full D major chord with the A on the bottom, and to add to that bottom, the bassoons play the A in octaves. I could have had both bassoons playing the same note, that's common, but when you double up the bassoons, they become more penetrating, more powerful. To use them to add richness to the bottom of the chord without drawing too much attention to them, I decided to put them in octaves instead. It could have been done differently without any harm, and different circumstances call for different sounds. Let's listen to the woodwind so far. You might notice that the woodwinds have a dotted quarter here. but the strings have a quarter note and a rest. When you have big chords in two sections of the orchestra, one doubling the other, it's very unusual to have this kind of difference. I chose it because I want two sounds. I want the power, the slightly percussive sound of strings chopping out a note and then resting and then hitting the next note. But I also want the ringing resonance of the woodwinds sustained through the loud part. Maybe it's too complicated and a little too micromanaging. I just liked the sound of it better. After the woodwinds, I typically turn to the brass. I'm going to save the heavy brass, the trumpets and trombones, for later. It's always better not to overuse them. I will use the horns, however. They're very sociable, these instruments. They can blend in with different sections of the orchestra. And here, I think I'll treat them as woodwinds. I'll use them to beef up this woodwind chord. They give a background resonance and added power. Normally, you would have 4 horns in an early Romantic orchestra. But I took the exact instrumentation from Schubert's 8th Symphony, which only uses 2 horns. Now we have the complete opening of the movement, an 8-measure crescendo. It's not a massive crescendo. It doesn't blow your ears off. It reaches a forte, not a fortissimo. And the heavy brass and timpani have not arrived, so it's just the first musical gesture. Let's hear all parts of the orchestra put together. It's starting to sound good. The next 8 measures are essentially the same, but with a variant of the melodic line. We could be lazy and orchestrate it the same way, but the ear always wants variety. Orchestration should be ever-changing. Here's how I did it the second time. The melody is now in the second violins, allowing the first violins to carry that sustained upper note. And a bassoon now doubles the melody an octave lower. It adds a little extra character, a kind of gritty emphasis, so the music has more oomph the second time around. And I've made a few other minor adjustments. The horns play a bigger role to thicken the sound, but it's really not that much different. And the passage ends exactly the same way with these string chords and the interlocking woodwinds and the horns. Now comes the first big surprise. These chords, in the next 4 measures, are very Schubertian, impossible in the classical period. Schubert invented this stuff. They jump into a different key, F major, without warning, and then jump back to the original key, D major. To emphasize that sudden surprise, I thought we could use the heavy brass, blaring out a fortissimo. That will shake up the audience. But first, as always, let's fill out the string chords. I decided to do something fun here. There's so many ways you could arrange the strings. There is no one right way. I like the dotted rhythm, and I'd like to carry it through to give the whole piece an aesthetic unity, so I put it in the strings in this manner. These are called double stops. I'm piling notes in the upper registers to give a dense, chopping sound. Let's listen to it. Now let's do the woodwinds. We already have that nice punchy rhythm carried by the strings, so the woodwinds only need to sustain the basic chords. Again, very simple voice leading, traditional interlocking, nothing complicated. There came a point in my study of orchestration, I think I was studying Beethoven, when I came to this realization that the best orchestration is always as simple as possible, but no simpler. You strip it down to the most common sense orchestration you can to accomplish what you need. It gets complicated only when necessary. By the way, that's a quote from Einstein. A theory should be as simple as necessary, but no simpler. Let's listen to these simple woodwind chords. Clarinets are the strongest instruments here. If the flutes were an octave higher, they'd stand out, but I don't want a distracting shriek here. And now let's deal with the brass. For the first time, let's put in the heavy brass. A very common way to use trombones is bunched together in the tenor part of the range, like a fist delivering a sound punch. I think of it like a 3-fingered fist all bunched together. Clever voice leading does not matter here. You just want this sound of trombones in what's called closed harmony. Here I open up the harmony a little just to make this last chord stand out as different. Now for the trumpets. Many composers use trumpets and trombones together as a sort of generalized heavy brass, but you don't need to, since we're channeling Schubert, and he loved the darker trombone sound by itself. Let's do that here. Let's save the trumpets until this final chord. That will make it stand out beautifully. I haven't forgotten the horns. Sometimes people try to figure out how the trombones and the trumpets and the horns interlock and stack together. The trombones are usually in the bottom range, the horns in the middle, the trumpets at the top, and they're supposed to blend together into one big brass sound. I have not had much success with that approach. I tend to write for the trombones and trumpets as if they're separate sections of the orchestra, each with its own personal character. But the horns are a little different. They're versatile. If they want to, they can stand on their own sound, or blend in with the trombones, or with the trumpets, or in this case fill in a background resonance. The horns and the bassoons and the highest trombone are forming a unit here, and that's a common alliance. For the final chord, I've doubled the horns and trumpets. I want this trumpet entrance to stand out with a powerful sound. Trumpets can cut through the orchestra, but they don't have a lot of weight to them. A standard approach is to double the trumpets with the horns. It sounds like a single powerful instrument with the cutting edge of the trumpets and the deeper power of the horns. They blend perfectly. Anyway, let's listen to the brass. I love the way the trumpets come in at the end. And bop, we've got to put in the timpani. That last chord, the one that pulls us out of the wrong key and back to the right key of D major, it deserves a timpani bonk for emphasis. Let's listen to these 4 measures with all the sections of the orchestra combined. The heavy brass is pretty overwhelming. That's why it's a sound to be used sparingly, and it really takes a lot of string power on these choppy notes to cut through the rest of the orchestra and be heard. When I show you how to orchestrate these separate segments, a few measures here, a few there, it's easy to miss what's really going on. Good orchestration has more to do with the change in sound, the change from one segment to the next, than it does with how any one segment sounds. That's true of everything in life, isn't it? It's all about contrasts. Today is happy because an unexpected treat happened that was better than yesterday. But if you get that treat every day and you come to expect it, then you don't have a special day anymore. It's all about contrast. With this loud part and this big chord here, the music is poised, ready for the next part, and we can immediately change the tone color, back away, and have something quieter. Let's have the upper strings carry this nice singing melody with another big fortissimo chord at the end of the phrase. Here's what it sounds like. We don't want to get rid of our dancey rhythms, so let's put them in, bopping in the background. And I thought it'd be fun, and very Schubertian, to make them alternate between the upper woodwinds and the lower strings. See, woodwinds up here, strings down there, woodwinds, strings. It gives a kind of kinetic, constantly changing feel. The reason for putting in the bassoon here is that the lower strings can sound a little sluggish sometimes. I want to hear the double eighth notes nice and crisp, bop, bop. And the bassoons with staccato will ensure that nice, clear articulation. For the big chord here, the triple stop and double stop give a nice big choppy emphasis. The woodwinds are in a standard distribution interlocked with each other. The horns are playing a simple octave. The trumpets are both hitting the same note. By doubling up, this note will really stand out. It will cut through everything else. The trombones are in the traditional closed, fist-like bunch, and a timpani bop. Let's hear what this section sounds like. In the next segment, again, we have a nice lilting melody. Let's put it in the upper strings. We'll emphasize that dancey rhythm in the lower strings. Notice that sometimes The violas can ally themselves with the cellos and basses if you want the bottom to really stand out. Let's listen to what we have. Now let's add the woodwinds. First, the bassoons can help the lower strings again, like this. For the upper woodwinds, let's do something very standard. We just had a bunch of melody in the strings, and I don't want to repeat the same sound. I want the sound to be always changing. So let's double the strings with the woodwinds in the simplest way. Just as the strings are in thirds, so the clarinets are in thirds. The oboes are doubling it, and the flutes are an octave higher. This stacking of woodwinds tilts the sound, the timbre, away from a string sound and toward a generalized woodwind sound. You'll see it all over romantic orchestration, these thirds that are doubling each other in different registers. A lot of times people ask, oh my God, there must be some clever, amazing reason why this complicated looking thing gives you just the right sound. How do you know how to write like this? And the answer is, no, it's not like that. In a way, orchestration isn't about the sound right here. It's about how the sound right here is different from the sound right before it. So instead of all the upper woodwinds following the melodic contour, I snuck in a sustained note in the oboes, just to give it a different flavor here. For the same reason, I'm putting the flutes higher so they stand out. The melody won't sound the same all the way through. The flutes will pop out here and cause a change in sound. Those unexpected twists and changes just keep the ear interested. The woodwinds sound like this. For the brass, I'll go really light in this segment. Let's give the heavy brass a rest. I'll use a horn sustaining note, just to help tie together the woodwinds and the strings with a bit of background resonance. It's like a bit of glue laid down to hold everything together. Sometimes people call this the blanket of horns. That's a snarky term, but it's a very useful method. Now we can listen to that whole passage full orchestra. We're coming in toward that first double bar, the end of the first major section of the movement. Let me turn this segment of sketch into proper string parts. I'm using a lot of the same tricks as before to vary the sound. It isn't just one sound all the way through. The sound is always changing in texture. Here the melody is gentler, carried in the first and second violins, while the rhythm is in the low strings. Here the first and second violins begin to double each other, which makes for a stronger sound. Sometimes I'm making them loud and impactful with double stops, and sometimes a little less intense. And the segment ends with the strings all on unison or octaves. Let's listen to these many changes of sound and texture. For the rest of the orchestration, let's look at the quiet part first. I want it to be delicate, so let's do no more than add a couple sustaining notes in the background. I haven't yet used a clarinet for that purpose, so I'll stick it in here. Really, this could have been anything, a bassoon, but I've used that already, and it's boring to reuse it. It could be an oboe, but I felt like that's too penetrating a sound. I want something more in the background. Sometimes people use a quiet trumpet or a trombone as a sustaining note, but that makes for a dark sound, and I don't really want that in this light passage. So why not the clarinet? It has a lot of character, and the horn takes over the sustain function here. Now for the loud part. There's nothing complicated here. We've had some nice quiet stuff, now let's make it loud. Absolutely standard orchestration. Full strings, timpani, trombones in a closed fist-like chord, trumpets very high up in their range, which will give a brilliant cutting sound. The reason I don't have both trumpets playing that upper note together is that it would be too penetrating and take over everything. Horns backing up the trumpets. You might ask, why put the woodwinds in this configuration? Why the bassoons in octaves? Why the clarinets in octaves? Why are the oboes suddenly down here and the flutes suddenly together on that high E? What special sound do you get with this magic distribution and not with another one? And the answer is, no, it's not like that. I wasn't after a special sound here. I just wanted to change. I wanted the woodwinds to switch around, change register, to give a sudden bold sense of surprise. And now everything is in octaves or unisons. All the woodwinds together in octaves make a very reedy sound with a lot of character. Let's listen to this passage in full orchestra. We've come to the end of the first section of the movement. Let's go back to the beginning and listen to the full score of that whole first section. It's 49 measures. It's not even 1 minute of music. There's a lot of detail, a lot of thinking and trying that goes into orchestrating even a short segment of music. But it's so much fun and it's so worth it. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed learning about orchestration, and make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. I'll talk to you next time as we continue this early romantic scherzo movement.